Welcome back to The Serial Entrepreneur. I'm your host, Anna Wood. In today's episode, I'm joined by Andrew Roughan, the CEO of innovation agency Plexal. We discuss the importance of collaboration in the industry, Plexal's 4 pillars of innovation support, and why the UK needs to find its subsector niches to excel in. Let's dig in.
Hey,
I'm very well, Anna. Thank you so much for having me.
thank you for coming on. So at the beginning of every episode, we ask the same icebreaker question, which is, what's your favourite breakfast cereal and why?
I usually follow very poor advice and don't have breakfast, but this morning I had some porridge. On a day like this, find that gives me good energy to get started.
Yeah, fair enough. It's a classic for a reason. So would you be able to introduce yourself and tell me about your background?
Sure. I'm Andrew Roughan. I'm Chief Executive Officer of Plexal, which is an innovation company that we're going to talk a lot about today. In terms of my background, so I'm 45 years old. I have a law degree. I have 2 boys, 2 children aged 8 and 12. My career has been about 25 years long, split half with technology sectors, telecoms, data centers, and then the other half in innovation and real estate.
Great. So, yeah, you mentioned Plexal. So what is it and what are you trying to achieve there?
Plexal is an innovation company, and we're trying to create a new category of organization. And what I mean by that is that Plexal has been created in order to create a value exchange, to stand in between organizations who need to collaborate in order to drive progress and drive change. And Plexal intends to be this interlocutor in the middle that understands the needs and wants of these organizations, whether you be an investor, an academic, government official, a technology leader, a startup. We want to stand in between all of those organizations and bring them together in order to drive their collaborations and support their growth and impact. Now, in order to do that, we have 4 different things that we do. The first thing is that we build places for innovators. So physical environments where ecosystems thrive because they've got services, they've got infrastructure, they've got community that draws them together. And we've got 6 places around the UK that are currently doing that. The second thing is we have a innovation consulting practice, which focuses on government-led innovation. So we're absolutely obsessed by the UK government's mission around science and technology and how we can use that as a bedrock for the future of our economy and the future of our society. And we go about helping government agencies and departments in order to drive that policy area. The third thing that we do is we help local government build science and technology innovation clusters. So where we can identify a magnet somewhere in the UK where we can build around that piece of infrastructure or that lab or that special circumstance that exists in all parts of the UK. And we help local government build around that and drive outcomes. And then finally, we work with startups, scale-ups and SMEs in order to specifically embed ourselves in their organizations and help them with growth and help them with causing the impact that they have the potential to do so.
Great. So how would you describe Plexal's mission in today's rapidly evolving innovation landscape?
So if I were to use one word, it would be fundamental. And the reason I use that word is that where I think we find ourselves as a country is in a very once-in-a-generation moment. Mm-hmm. I describe ourselves as being in a technology super cycle where in 5 years, 20 or 30 years of progress will happen. And I think that's evident in what's happened in AI in the last few years. Mm-hmm. And I think that pace and that urgency, I think, really needs to flood its way through the economy in order for us to grasp this opportunity. I also think we find ourselves in a position where the traditional political models, trading models, global collaborations and relationships just are clearly unsteady for obvious reasons. We need to grasp new positions, new friendships, new collaborations, new opportunities as a country and the system that operates underneath it. I think the urgency around redistributing wealth, I think, could never be as important, and getting it into different parts of the economy, different regions, different geographies. And I think we are very important to that. And also the semblance of perma-crisis around recovering from COVID and then the impending bite of climate change and what that brings, feels like we're in a very fundamental tipping point moment where, as a nation, I think we need to be together on our A game, really driving positivity into these as opportunity. And I fear that if we're not in that position in 5 years or 10 years' time, I think we'll regret it, and we'll look back at this moment where we should have acted. And I want Plexal to be right in the middle of that opportunity.
Yeah, great. So, are there any sectors or technology that Plexal is most focused on supporting at the moment?
Definitely. And so we are very focused on the UK government's science and technology priority areas. So those are, in no particular order, quantum, artificial intelligence, semiconductors, engineered biology, and future of telecoms. So that forms the kind of basis for which we go to market and where we build our skill sets from, how we engage with customers. Traditionally, we've been very focused on all things data, all things networked. So cybersecurity is a really fundamental foundation of everything that we do. And we're trying to bring together the adjacencies between technology areas and sectors, and just making sure we can translate appropriately. When we talk about quantum, what does that mean for manufacturing? What does that mean for broadcast? What does that mean for government, for example? And having that ability to be deep in a technology domain at the same time as understanding the end user, I think is a core competence of ours.
Great. So obviously you mentioned the kind of 4 main pillars of support. What exactly is the support that Plexal offers to startups?
So if I underline Growth Partnership, which was an initiative that we launched about a month ago now. Now, our observation is that the UK government has been really clear that their number one mission is to get the economy growing. Now, when we look at the interventions that are being used in order to stimulate growth, we think there's one big dynamic missing. So there's lots of great central government interventions like accelerator programs, which are picking out cohorts of startups and giving them a push forward. There's loads of local government initiatives like Growth Hub, which are providing areas of advice and consultation to help startups and scale-ups that might have a query or might need direction as to where they go. Our observation is there's one massive component missing, which is if you are a growing company, how do you get something embedded in the organization that's going to roll their sleeves up and really help cause growth, to unblock, implement new initiatives, drive, find new customers, get new funding. So what the Growth Partnership is all about is understanding the scale and the reach that Plexal has generated over the course of its 8 years of existence, the networks that we have. We want to start to put that expertise to work, but within startups, scale-ups and SMEs, and embed members of our team into those organizations, roll our sleeves up, form part of the team, and achieve growth milestones that will really push those organizations on. Now, that's not to say it will replace anything local government or anything central government are doing, but I think it has the opportunity to augment and really accelerate the growth of the organizations who are absolutely within our target audiences that we think can cause the economy to grow in the very near term.
Yeah, it's really important as well, because I don't know the exact stat, but it's something that like 90% of businesses in the UK are startups and SMEs. So it is important to make sure that those businesses do grow.
Yeah, I think, Anna, it's actually more acute than that. So if my stats are correct, I think it's 99.8% of all companies are SMEs. But 99.8%. Of that, 60% of the employed workforce work for SMEs, and 53% of all private sector revenues in the UK are generated by SMEs. So you've got this huge opportunity. Imagine if we could just take 1% of those companies and really transform their fortunes and double their growth profiles. We can make a really tangible national impact to the economy.
Yeah, it will be a huge, huge difference for the UK. So how has Plexal's strategy evolved since its founding, and what do you think have been the major turning points in that?
So Plexal, the reason for its being was very much linked to Olympic legacy, so the 2012 Olympics. So myself and one other gentleman called Gavin Poole responded to a government procurement opportunity to take over the media and TV studios from the Olympics. And our goal was to create them into this innovation campus, bringing together the technology sectors and the creative sectors, and attracting universities, startups, government, and industry. And that has successfully formed into a business called Here East. Now, Plexal was launched in support of that effort on the Olympic Park, and that's where our headquarters is. That's where our heritage lies. But Plexal had its own pathway as well. So not only supporting the success of that campus and that regeneration project on the Olympic Park, which has been hugely successful, but also supporting a pathway that could have national and international effect, that could have a consulting business that would allow us to grow and scale. Mm-hmm. Now, you asked the question around, so what's changed since the start? Now, originally, I think we thought we'd be much more about real estate than innovation. That's certainly changed. We're much more now about innovation than we are about real estate. But we use real estate as a really important feature of bringing communities together. We realized the co-working business model very early on was going to be quite challenging, and you only have to follow the prospects of WeWork to understand why. But luckily enough, when we launched our innovation consulting practice, that was with that in mind, that we needed diversity of income. We needed to mean more, if that makes sense. So the first phase of our growth was all about underpinning what we meant by government-led innovation. So partnering with UK government, driving this new category of organisation into their supply chain, and really gaining trust. We'd just about done that, and COVID hit. And to be a startup as we were at that time, we were probably 35 people. We're now 100. But 35 people entering COVID with two main lines of business, one real estate and one government. We couldn't have been more threatened. We were loss-making at the time, so not ideal in terms of the circumstances, but we had a really, really patient and supportive investor that helped us through that journey. Now, what that gave us was new energy, new guile, new commitment to making our model work. And we used COVID as the opportunity to sprint immediately out of lockdown to really start to scale our business. And what that enabled us was to build capability in Manchester and in Cheltenham, to really broaden our government customers into particularly things like national security and the intelligence communities, into Ministry of Defence, into the Foreign Office. And we've since been lucky to land contracts in the Middle East and in Singapore to take our efforts built in the UK to those marketplaces and create innovation bridges between those ecosystems.
Great. So what do you believe are the biggest challenges that are facing startups today, and how does Plexal help startups overcome these challenges?
My view on this is I think there are some very traditional challenges that I'm sure this podcast investigates often. So access to talent, access to capital, access to markets and customers. And I probably won't bore you with talking about those things because I think they're well discussed and well understood. The one thing I think is lurking in the background and maybe causing some concern is some of the glamour about being labelled a startup. Mm-hmm. And I think it's very easy to claim the status of startup, particularly early in your journey when all of your progress is ahead. But when one defines what a startup is, doubling in size every 2 years, raising money probably more regularly than that, going through the talent scaling process, the customer acquisition process, the entering new market process, I think it's very easy to fall off that startup status quickly and find yourself in SME territory, but without the support network that might enable you to come out of there or enable you to thrive in that part of the economy. And I think there's a slight danger that we all, I think, encourage people to continue the label of startup but not behave like a startup. And I think it's incumbent on organisations like Plexal in order to make sure that when we talk about growth strategy, we're very real in terms of the type of organisation and the part of the market you find yourself in, so that the right tactics are deployed. Growing a small organisation that has the potential to double over 5 years, 10 years maybe, is amazing, and we can create a great impact to the economy, but we wouldn't use the same tools and techniques that we would with a genuine startup that had to have much more aggression, much more speculation, much more risk investment deployed into it. And I think part of our role with Growth Partnership is to drive much more direct and customer specific or company specific interventions in order to ensure that growth happens at the right level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. So in your view, what do you think are the essential ingredients for a thriving startup ecosystem?
So firstly, a collaborative spirit. And I think if we talk about tech here, which is probably the easiest thing to relate to when we talk about startups, if we talk about an ecosystem that is heavily software based, not exclusively, that software is all virtualized. It tends towards open source rather than closed. It's heavily distributed and uses cloud as a distribution technique. Now, everything there talks about collaboration. So no one organization is going to build all of that capability on their own. So as a starter, we need to make sure we're collaborative. We need to understand channels, partners, and alliances. So some of the behemoth organizations that are integral for startup ecosystems to succeed, such as the hyperscale community, we need to make sure they're plugged in at the right level, but their business model is understood. So when we start talking about feeding in things like cloud credits to communities, we understand the nuance of that and then what the implications are of building one's product on that type of infrastructure. We can see skills, we can see intellectual property, we can see product and product development dynamics, we can see customers, and we can access capital. And having that kind of whole of market view on what a functional ecosystem brings, I think is really important. Now, I think there's a tendency to, hence the conversation, Anna, that we form ecosystems which are 100% participated by startups. I would much more encourage a much more democratic, startups being one component of an ecosystem, but everyone else is present too. So the investors are there, the universities are there, the young talent is there, the examples who have already exited are there, the large organizations are there, the ultimate end user is there, and building thriving ecosystems that can have multi-dimensions, they can come together as a whole or in part. And then I say selfishly for our role is they have an orchestrator. So someone in the middle of it all serving up value when they can see it identified.
Yeah, definitely. The concept of an ecosystem without all the different players within it, and if it is just startups, seems almost not complete. You need those different people who want to either work in startups, who don't, and the big corporates as well, and the government. It really needed to make sure that the startups in the ecosystem can thrive, but also that the startups can almost give back to the other kind of components of it too.
Yeah, I completely agree.
So you also mentioned Plexal's physical spaces. Why do you think physical spaces are still so important, even though we're in such a kind of digital world and people are making connections online?
I'm really, really passionate about this. So my heart sank when I saw the reality of COVID and workforces being distributed and locked in their homes. And of course, for a period of time, that was a health and safety reality, and we all had to embrace it, and we had to do our best in order to get through that period of time. And what amazing progress was made with using tools like we're working on now to enable workforces to communicate from wherever they are. But to my mind, there's no replacement for human to human contact. There's no replacement for the energy, the passion, the new ideas that can be sparked when you're in the same room together. The few minutes before the meeting starts, the few minutes after the meeting starts, the opportunities to grab a coffee or, a meal together, those things that really form relationships, and whether it be colleague to colleague or customer to supplier, but they actually form the basis of trust and the reason why you'll collaborate again and again and again. I find, digital engagement and virtual engagement is really efficient, really, makes things possible that weren't before, and certainly more efficient. But I think if it entirely replaces face-to-face and human contact, I think we'll be a much worse society as a result of it. And in the prior conversation, we talked about ecosystems, and I fear if one believes that a virtual ecosystem can really drive the benefits that we are hoping for, that those meetups, those beer and pizza nights, if I pick a stereotype, but the buzz that you can get out of communities coming together, and particularly those that naturally wouldn't come together with each other. This serendipity, the overused word, but that the chance encounter that you stumble across halfway through a networking event that you would never find on a virtual online platform. I really celebrate those moments, and I think we should try and navigate to more of them, not less of them, while still using the efficient tools that as they present themselves to us.
Yeah, definitely. I was talking to a startup a little while ago, and they were saying how they've got an office in a workspace. They're a med tech company, but they were saying how they talk to people in different industries. But from that, they come up with ideas for what they're doing, even though they're working on two completely different sectors. They're doing two completely different things, but speaking with someone and hearing their challenges in a different sector, they've got the same challenges. They're like, oh, okay, I kind of know what I'm meant to do now.
Yeah, if I give you a snapshot of one of our locations, in fact, the one on the Olympic Park at Here East, and it's a huge facility, so if it's about 1,000 people, and if I think about 4 offices in a row, I've got one global charity that helps families post natural disasters, and they're called Deventi. Next to TJC, which is a public safety and public security technology consultant, works heavily across UK government and beyond. Next to M Squared Lasers, which is a spin-out of Strathclyde University focused on quantum laser technology. Next to Block Dojo, who are a blockchain accelerator program. And you say that these guys would never crash into each other naturally, but they happen to be in this community where they'll have moments to, interweave with each other and share ideas, and even share the kind of lack of complementary views and challenge each other, why they think their method or their product is right. But I really do, I really do celebrate that kind of adjacency and sometimes even the diversity of these organizations coming together to spark new ideas.
Yeah, definitely. So how is Plexal approaching diversity and inclusion within its ecosystem?
So I mentioned at the start, our heritage dates back to the Olympic Games in London, and that's really important from the perspective. From day one, it gave us this social regeneration mentality, this focus at first geographically around East London, and focused on some of the challenges and the reasons why that part of London was chosen for the host of the Olympics. Now, since then, everything that we've built within Plexal has purpose in mind, regeneration in mind, and transformation in mind. Now, from a diversity, equity, and inclusion perspective, it kind of flows through the organisation at many levels. So, for example, 53% of our staff, so the 100 people we've got, are female. So we've got a really strong basis for female leadership within the organisation and a diverse workforce. We ran something a number of years ago alongside UCL called East London Inclusive Enterprise Zone, which is about giving opportunity to parts of the economy that otherwise wouldn't be presented to it, particularly focused on disability-led organisations. So we had an accelerator program that was called Open Door, which was focused on generating opportunity for companies that were either serving the disabled community or were founders who were disabled. And we worked with 10 organisations over the course of a year in order to drive benefit and impact. We focus a lot on, I mentioned, redistribution of wealth around the economy. So working with regional organisations, local governments, and things like that, about getting monies to flow through economic activity into different parts of the economy. And that could be geographic differences, or it could be certainly demographic differences within the economy. I myself, I'm the outgoing chair of a charity focused on youth participation within democracy. That's looking for the corners of the communities that otherwise wouldn't have a voice, coming into politics, coming into government, and trying to really encourage that participation going through. And then, just to name one other item, so we were a partner organisation in the founding of something called the Global Disability Innovation Hub a number of years ago, which was focused on creating a centre of excellence for assistive technology. So led by UCL, partnered with Loughborough University and the Mayor of London, but building a capability that could allow for technology to be exported to the developing world that would transform people's lives around how it would help the disabled communities. They've since raised £61 million worth of funding from the UK government in order to do that. They're prolific in the export of that type of capability. Now, that's just a small snapshot of some of our approaches to DEI programs, but I hope you can see it. Our view is it's fundamental to the current. I think collaboration can't work with integrity unless you've got focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion. It needs to flood through the organisation from who you hire, who you work with, what impact you can have. And when I mentioned who we work with, I think 60% of our supply chain now is SMEs. So we're really trying to hold ourselves to account to live and breathe what we say. So rather than having a statement that from time to time you can back up with evidence, it's actually showed as the reason you're here, the reason you're trusted to have the impact that you might have.
Yeah, it's great to hear because it's so easy for organisations to kind of say one thing and do something else. Actually, walking the walk as well as talking the talk's a really big thing you can kind of shout about.
Yeah, and particularly hard, I think, in the current context of what's going on globally, where you can see people starting to get relaxed about it because there's less global political pressure around the topic. And I think it's those organisations that fall away now, you kind of can highlight as those that were most fragile in the movement anyway. And I think it's for those of us who've got the commitment and the long-term view actually to remain, quite stoic in our approach that says we set out on this journey for good reason 14 years ago. We're not stopping now. We've only started and we've got to keep going. And if others around us fall away, that means we've got to work harder.
Yeah, it's actually staying committed to a goal that you have set and not. I feel like some companies have seen other organizations kind of fall back and be like, well, we could do that too. Obviously, people don't really care about it. Whereas it's important to see the companies that are kind of doubling down and saying, no, we're committed to this. It's really important to see.
100% agree.
So earlier on in our conversation, you mentioned about how we're kind of in a once in a generation growth thing. How do you see the UK's innovation and startup ecosystem evolving over the next 5 years?
I think it's interesting you use the term 5 years. I think we've really got to get our game together quicker than that in order so that by 5 years we can see proof and evidence of progress. Now, and I think there's a few things I'd pick out. So first one is commitment to scaling. Now, we're often celebrated or pat ourselves on the back for being a great place to start a business and a great place to for the early stages of scale, but we fall away too quickly. I think we've really got to change that. The way in which I think we can change that is be really clear on the big bets the UK is willing to make and really back the scaling organisations that fit the categories, the priority categories, presumably outlined by the industrial strategy that's coming. But I think we need to be really clear on how we're going to create the pathways for growth for those organisations, how we're going to build them into global leaders, and how the UK economy and society is going to benefit from that. Now, that'll take difficult decisions on things like sovereign funding, on things like visas, potentially even things like national investment vehicles that can support, strategic growth in particular organisations. I think the second thing is we probably need to stop doing quite a lot of things that we're not very good at. Marketplaces where there are others more appropriate to lead in, copycat activities where we can see something going on elsewhere in the world that perhaps we're trying to copy here. And I think they're not going to drive huge value to our startup community and huge value in scaling. They might be tactical activity, but I think we've got to almost deduplicate some of those efforts. I think we've got to get the combination of skills, product, customer, and capital working. And I think identifying ecosystems that can have access to all four of those things is materially important. And I think doing that in a much more hands-on way, I think would be appreciated by a lot of people. So very clear signposting that if you're in a particular category of sector or technology domain, you know where your ecosystem is. It's very clearly signposted to you. And then you know that there's an organization or a set of organizations there who are incentivized in order to help you. Now, that incentivization can form, have different ways, paid or unpaid, but knowing there are ecosystems out there that can be activated in order to drive that to happen. And, they will selflessly drive value for organizations who participate. That's what I'd like to see happen over the next 5 years. And the connection between government, industry, startup, universities, really allowing the UK to thrive at a time when our global partners and competitors might be focused elsewhere. I think we've got an opportunity now to really drive progress.
Yeah. I guess you mentioned earlier about how there's certain tech sectors that you're more looking towards. But as someone working within the industry, what do you personally think are the sectors to kind of look out for within the next couple of years that are really going to be seeing huge growth?
So my view is that I think the UK, given where we're at on the global stage and the evolution of technology, I think needs to be focused very clearly at a subdomain level. Now, with huge respect, I think it's very difficult for us to claim a future leadership position in artificial intelligence, given the huge investments being made in the US and China and the first mover advantage that both of those economies have got on things like large language models. So I wouldn't advocate, for example, around a sovereign large language model that could compete on a global stage. I don't think the investment's available, and I don't think the pace of progress will be quick enough in order to compete. That said, I think we can be global leaders in things like AI security and AI safety. Mm-hmm. And I think that is both relevant to our heritage. So UK has always been a leader in cybersecurity, and I think it's really leading the charge on online safety through things like the recent legislation. And I think that can give us a position around the regulation of AI, the ethics of AI, that really creates this sub-market that allows us to thrive internationally. Mm-hmm. I think there is equivalence in quantum computing that gives us, again, following the same logic, I don't think we can compete at the supercomputer level. I don't think we've got the investment there. I don't think the track record isn't there in order to do that. But we can absolutely compete at things like quantum laser technology, things like GPS futures, and how one leads the use of quantum into certain industries, particularly defense and national security. And so I think my answer is, I think there is a level of thought required that will drive a level of action that probably hasn't been present in prior industrial strategies. But I'm really confident that, the way the government's working now is that we're going to identify some of these areas and create specific vehicles to allow them, to signpost to startups and scale-ups that this is where we want you to go, and we're going to support your pathway there, and we're going to, ensure your success. As you bring the quality, we'll bring the framework to drive your success.
Mm-hmm. Yes, almost like the UK needs to find its niches within those huge sectors of tech.
Exactly.
My final question is, what are Plexal's biggest priorities over the next 12 months?
So we have a number, as you might expect. So at this very sad moment, it's so clear that defence and national security is increasingly a priority for the country. So we really want to scale our presence in both national security and defence innovation in order to allow not only the UK economy to thrive from that opportunity, but to enable the national security of our shores and our partners. There's a number of initiatives that have recently been announced and will be forthcoming in the next strategic defence review, which enables funding for partnerships with people like NATO, specific initiatives within the Ministry of Defence, and then Plexal itself is working across the intelligence community in order to drive novel technology and its adoption. So that's certainly number one priority. I think number two priority is establishing and scaling our presence in local government and making sure that we use this moment of local government devolution, local government reform as a moment to change the way in which we think about economic growth regionally, and really starting to try and manhandle growth potential at the same time as aligning with other places in the country to make sure we're not building 5 AI hubs around the country. We're actually deduplicating and ensuring that we're complementing the national makeup. So that's number 2. And then number 3 is following through on what we've committed to on the growth partnership and really embedding ourselves with hundreds of startups, scale-ups and SMEs in order to evidence how we can help them grow. And when I say evidence, is number of jobs, amount of capital raised, amount of customer contracts secured, amounts of exit, and transformation caused by our thriving and fledgling startup community.
Great. And kind of finally, is there anything else that you wanted to add that you don't feel we've covered so far?
Maybe underline rather than add, Anna, if it's okay. So what's quite unique about Plexal's approach is this combination of place and innovation. And I really would love to leave listeners with the view that you have to have the two together, because if you disconnect them, it's very difficult to give them individually reason for being. Now, to underline the conversation we had about virtual working and coming together is like ecosystems that physically interact. We can demonstrate a 6 times return on growth. So those that are active in innovation ecosystems are growing much faster than those that are not. And the second thing is, I think that getting public sector and private sector closer together on innovation, I think, is really important. That we don't have islands where policy after policy and legislation after legislation comes out, but it doesn't have any effect in the real economy. And as a result, we need bridging organisations like Plexal in order to understand and receive the direction of government, and then roll our sleeves up and go to work and be the advocates, the evangelists, and the supporters of the startups. And that for me is the reason we're here. That back and forth to make sure that the public seed funds and then the private sector benefits, and then we go again on the next strategic priority.
Yeah. Well, great. And to leave listeners on that note, I'll just say thank you so much for coming on the podcast today, Andrew. It was lovely learning more about what Plexal does and to hear your opinion.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me, Anna.
Yeah, thank you. I look forward to seeing what's next for Plexal.
Yeah. We will definitely keep you in touch. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
If you like this episode, be sure to subscribe to the podcast and check out Startup Magazine's socials to stay up to date on the latest startups news.